Just recently, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the international community was unable to stop that. I think at this stage it's a good idea to look back in history and see when did the UN and US intervene in armed conflicts and wars, and what were the results, but also when did they not intervene. Our story starts in 1950. The Second World War is over, but the world is divided in two camps. On one hand, you have communism led by Russia, and on the other hand, you have capitalism led by United States. The communism is on the rise. They are expanding. United States and the capital states struggle to contain that expansion. That same year, North Korea, which is communist, attacks South Korea, which is capitalist. And in a very short time, North Korea takes over most of the South. And then the United Nations passed a resolution to help South Korea. Of course, the biggest sponsor here is the United States. United Nations passes this resolution because Russia, which could actually veto, doesn't do that. Because they were boycotting the UN at that time. You see, the UN had accepted Taiwan as the representative of China at that time. And Russia boycotted the UN because of that decision. So they were not really joining any kind of decision-making mechanism. Because of that, the UN could decide and send troops. In addition to the United States, countries like Turkey and many other countries joined and sent soldiers and still struggled to contain North Korea because North Korea was supported by Russia and China. It was like a little world war in Korea, which devastated the country. All cities were bombed, millions were dead, but in the end, the coalition was able to stop North Korea and save South Korea, more or less at the borders, the way we know today. On one hand, we had millions of loss of life. It was a conflict worse than the Second World War when you look at the percentage of civilians dead of Korea. But on the other hand, you could also argue today South Korea is a flourishing democracy, a country which contributes quite a lot to humanity, technology, but also in culture, a country where people live in peace and with high living standards. On the other hand, North Korea is a country, is a dictatorship where its people suffer, and that's actually, they don't contribute to humanity at all. On the other hand, it's more a danger to humanity. From this kind of perspective, you could argue that it was a successful intervention indeed. Now we go to the year 1956, to Egypt, to be specifically to the Suez Channel. The Suez Channel is one of the most important waterways of the world. It's a man-made waterway, and trade from Europe to Asia, a significant part from there. At that time, it was under the ownership of the British and French. Although it was in Egypt, they did not have ownership of it. And at that time, they decided to do something against it and announced that they will nationalize it. The British and French protested, and Israel even invaded. And soon after, British and French also sent troops and easily won against the Egyptians. But the international community reaction was very strong. Russia, the Soviet Republic at that time, announced that they will not tolerate this. They even threatened with war. But the interesting part is that, because Russia was a bit aligned, Soviets were aligned with Egypt, United States also condemned it. Actually, they had told the British that they will not tolerate something like this. So these two powers mobilized the whole international community, and the General Assembly condemned this action. And United States also threatened with huge financial pressure on Britain. And in the end, Britain, France, and Israel had to withdraw their troops. And the Suez Channel, in the end, became Egyptian. This was one of the few examples where the two big powers agreed on intervention and successfully actually helped a weaker country against greater powers. Now let's go to the Vietnam War. It lasted between 1955 and 75. exactly 20 years. It ended up with the fall of Saigon. It's quite similar to the Korean War, you could say, because North Vietnam was communist, the South was capitalist. Again, the North had the initiative, and they wanted to invade the South and unite Vietnam under communist leadership. The North was supported by Russia and China, the South from United States and other capitalist countries. When the North invaded, United States helped and other capitalist countries also. One big difference, there was no United Nations resolution this time. Russia was using its veto and it was very divided, the United Nations. There was no common United Nations view on this conflict. So there was no resolution or nothing like that. So United States with some allies soldiered on, and they had to pour more and more resources. At one point, 600,000 Americans were fighting to keep southern Vietnam falling to the communist north. But northern Vietnamese, the so-called Viet Cong, proved out to be a very formidable enemy, very difficult to fight. And the United States poured more resources, but they also started using, they even did war crimes, using gas, using napalm bombs, atrocities against civilians. Of course, the Viet Cong did it as well. But the United States quickly lost also their moral high ground. That's why also one of the reasons also the anti-war movement in the United States get much stronger. The public support for this war crumbled. And so without any successes and without that support, United States decided to withdraw. And soon after, actually also South Vietnam fell and North Vietnam united the country under communism. This was the end of an era. United States became very demoralized. Their appetite for interventions decreased dramatically. And for a while, they really did not feel like any kind of intervention abroad. Now we go to the year 1979 to Afghanistan. Just a few years after the Vietnam War, and the Soviet Republic made a similar experience like the United States. Afghanistan already had a communist government, but that government controlled only some part of the country and was fighting a bitter war against some tribal warriors called the Mujahideen. And then a fraction in the Communist Party in Afghanistan took over that the Soviet Republic did not approve. They were very suspicious that this new fraction will move the country from the communist camp to the capitalist camp. To stop that from that happening, they sent troops in the country. They killed the president and instead placed a puppet government in place. Then they already had those troops, those Soviet troops in the country, and they started fighting the Mujahideen so that they can unite the whole country under communism. The United Nations members condemned this, but they could not pass a resolution, binding resolution, because Russia, of course, Soviet Republic, was a veto-yielding member. But a non-binding resolution was passed, and there was huge criticism against Soviet Republic, even from more sympathetic countries. However, United States was already not in a mood to intervene anywhere, and the whole international community thought that it is futile to intervene against such a strong power. So it actually stayed with only condemning this action. However, many countries sent arms to the Mujahideen, some of them even the famous Stingray missiles that could bring down advanced helicopters. And in the end, the Mujahideen was victorious. The Soviets sent more and more troops and equipment, but could not win. And actually, some analysts think that even this actually Afghanistan war quickened to the end of the whole Soviet empire. In the end, the Soviet troops were seen celebrating that they were finally allowed to leave Afghanistan. After their victory against the British a century ago, the Mujahideen had won against, again, another superpower. And it will not end the last one, like the history has shown later. Now we jump 10 years and go to the year 1991 to Kuwait. This is the year when the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein decided that he wants to invade that country. He was feeling the heat a bit internally. He was a bit afraid that they might try to replace him. And he was also in financial difficulties. Iraq was in financial difficulties. They had accumulated a lot of debt from the Iran-Iraq war, and the oil prices were also low. So he had some trouble financially. And he thought that that's why it would be a brilliant idea to get Kuwait, which is a rich country, oil rich country, that could help solve some of his financial problems, but also strengthen his domestic position. He would look again like a strong leader that you don't want to actually mess with. He was justifying his claim on Kuwait with some very old claim from the Ottoman times. Kuwait belonged to the Ottoman province of Basra. Iraq had inherited Basra, so his logic was that Kuwait belonged to Basra and belonged to Iraq. It was a bit nonsense, of course, by that time, because previous Iraqi governments had officially recognized Kuwait already, so there was no claim from those times. He was also thinking that he could get away with invading Kuwait because he thought that the United States, even if they would be to intervene, would not have the stomach to fight long because of the Vietnam syndrome. He thought that the anti-war public would intervene, and then at one point again, the United States would not want to prolong their engagement. He also thought that the Arab countries would also not do too much neither, because the Arab public also would not, such a Western Arab kind of combination, would not have Arab public support. So he thought that the intervention would be weak and he could get away with actually invading Kuwait. Now we know, of course, he miscalculated terribly. After he invaded very fast, there was a United Nations resolution condemning and actually authorizing also the use of force. Even Russia, actually, because of other Arab dynamics, also agreed with this. So this was really unanimous. Everyone agreed on that. The United States-led coalition entered Kuwait and freed that country. The Iraqi forces could hardly, it was just in 5 weeks, it was all over, and they could not really fight such an overwhelming force. This is one of the examples where intervention was very swift, very fast, and very successful. Now we move on to a much less successful intervention. 92-94 Somalia. This country was in a civil war. Two warlords were fighting each other, and the inhabitants were suffering terribly. So the UN sent aid, and later also peacekeepers, so that these two fractions don't kill each other. United States also sent soldiers, up to 25,000, I think. But the UN also had quite a passive mandate. They shouldn't be really fighting, they should be just hoping that they don't get attacked. But they didn't achieve anything. The United Nations struggled to keep the peace because they were very aggressive warlords and a very messy situation. And the United States get very disappointed with that failure and decided to take their troops out. They left only like 1,500 troops in the country. And after that, the United Nations peacekeepers, a big Pakistani force, get attacked by one of the warlords. 24 of them died. United Nations wanted to punish the warlord who's responsible for it, or at least some of his people, and asked United States for help. The United States didn't have too many soldiers in the country, but they flew some special forces, and then tried to actually bring that warlord to justice. And while trying to do that, 2 of their helicopters fell and 18 of their soldiers died. And it was then, a movie was shot, maybe you might have watched it. And that was the end of the United States involvement in Somalia. This is one of the more least successful intervention, one can argue. It certainly still achieved something, but up to today, Somalia is still not in peace. Now we move on 1 year to 94, Rwanda. This is considered one of the biggest failures of international intervention. At that time in Rwanda, there was already a civil war between the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutu were the majority tribe, like around 70%, 80% of the population, and also had the government. The Tutsi were the minority, and there was a Tutsi-based rebel faction, moving from outside actually, fighting the central government. And there were already peacekeepers from the United Nations in the country, led by Belgium. And then the prime minister, the Hutu prime minister plane got shot down and he died. This was basically the start of the genocide, because the Hutu decided to attack Tutsis all around the country, whether if they're involved in the rebellion or not. The Belgian peacekeepers couldn't do anything. After they lost around 12 of their commandos, they didn't help anyone. And the United Nations also did not react. There are several reasons for that. On one hand, it was also the time of the Bosnian conflict, so Yugoslavia was really getting a lot of attention, a bit distraction. It was also 1 year after Somalia, and Somalia was regarded as a huge failure by the United States. United States was actually questioning the whole idea of UN peacekeepers. They were criticizing them as completely useless. So the United Nations was very reluctant to define this as a genocide that needs to be stopped, because they thought that even if they sent peacekeepers, they were afraid that they will not achieve anything. Add to this the role of France. France actually was helping the government against the rebels until the very end. And because they were doing that, because they were afraid that the Tutsi rebels were too Anglo-Saxon. And they wanted to support the Francophone Hutu government. And they didn't want to lose power to these English speakers. So this kind of consideration made that they also did not have an interest in UN intervention. This is one of the reasons, this kind of political consideration, not very motivated and very UN-critical US, and also distracted public. No one was really reporting. The whole attention was in Yugoslavia. No one did not really care about this topic. The UN was very afraid of another failed peacekeeping attempt. So everyone, the French anyway, didn't even want it. All together ended up in Rwanda, one of the worst genocides in history. More than 1 million people died. 400,000 to 800,000 Tutsi were murdered. And it only ended when the Tutsi rebels themselves were able to come in the country and stop this genocide. This was considered as one of the biggest failures of international intervention because there were many complicated reasons. And actually only recently France, for instance, apologized for its role in this genocide from Rwanda officially. We now move on to another civil war, this time in Europe, in Bosnia, between the years 92 and 95. Bosnia was part of ex-Yugoslavia, which was a multi-ethnic country. And when Yugoslavia dissolved, the most dominant country, Serbia, wanted to take over the whole territory. And then a civil war started between Croatia and Bosnia, Muslim on one hand and Serbia on the other hand. The United Nations intervened with peacekeepers, which were actually supposed to protect civilians. But they failed to do so, similar to in Rwanda. In one terrible episode, the Dutch peacekeeper did not intervene when Serbians massacred 8,000 civilians in Srebrenica, which is considered a genocidal event. The Dutch not only did not intervene, they even prevented civilians coming from their compound and let them die. This was one of the most famous episodes of United Nations peacekeeping. After this episode, United Nations brought a conference together, and then NATO agreed to do a military intervention to stop the Serbians. And after this intervention, peace came to that region. This was not only a shame for United Nations, but also Europe in general, because Bosnia is quite central. Central to East Europe, and there are very big, strong countries, Germany, France, and so on, and they let this kind of genocidal event happen in the middle of Europe. Without American intervention, it might have continued. A few years later, in 1999, in Kosovo, we had a new conflict with similar actors. In Kosovo, an Albanian majority was living under Serbian central government, and they rebelled against that. They started a guerrilla war, and Serbia had difficulties containing these rebellious activities. But at one point they decided to intervene with their full military might. This time, however, NATO, and under the leadership of the United States, did not wait until UN approval, did not wait until UN really decided to intervene, but unilaterally attacked Serbia and stopped such a genocidal event from happening. At least that was their reasoning. Today, this is one of the most controversial interventions by the United States and the NATO. As I said, it did not have a United Nations approval. But it's also quite understandable because last time United Nations had waited until a genocide happened, and the United States and the NATO did not wait until it comes to that point this time. The 1999 Kosovo intervention had already shown that the United States and NATO was willing to act on their own without waiting for the deliberations of United Nations. After September 11, the attack on the Twin Towers on Pentagon by Al-Qaeda, who were sitting in Afghanistan, United States declared war on terror. And that would also begin the start of a much more interventionist policy by United States. The war on terror started with an attack on Afghanistan. Afghanistan was harboring Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So the United States made an ultimatum to the Taliban. Either you deliver Osama and his cronies, or we will attack you within 2 weeks. When the Taliban did not comply, the United States initiated the attacks, and in a very short time they were gone. United States attacked the Taliban without the consent of the United Nations, and they explained this, the legal justification of their attack, as self-defense. In the end, Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan and they had attacked the United States. United States' appetite for international intervention was not completely satisfied with Afghanistan only. So just 2 years later, they also intervened in Iraq in 2003. Their justification for their attack was that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. The United Nations had already passed a resolution banning that, and there was also talk about some consequences for Iraq. However, those consequences were never really specified, and it would have needed another UN resolution which explicitly permit the use of force against Iraq, which never happened, because the United States and also UK were in no mood to wait anymore. They claimed that they had proved that Iraq was developing weapons, and they right away attacked the country. Iraqi defenses were very weak, they could not defend themselves, and Saddam's government collapsed right away. And at first, actually the American soldiers and British soldiers were welcomed as liberators, because the majority of the country come from the Shia sect, and there was a Kurds, and Saddam comes from the Sunni minority and oppressed these Shias and Kurds terribly. So they were quite happy for Saddam to be gone. So the Americans were really welcomed by them. However, Americans were brilliant in planning the war and executing it, but they were very unprepared in actually planning the peace. They had just destroyed all the structure of the state, disbanded the army, and so on. In the end, this meant that Iraq ended up in complete internal warfare, and most of the country was destroyed. Many people died. And today, it's very difficult to see this intervention as a success. And especially so because those weapons of mass destruction were never found. 2011, Libya. These were the times of the Arab Spring. Pro-democracy protesters were bringing down dictators in Tunisia, Algeria, and also Egypt. But in Libya, the dictator decided to fight against his own people. There was international reaction, and the United Nations approved military intervention. It happened because China, Russia, but also Germany did not vote, but also did not veto this military intervention, because the Arab state also requested it. Especially Saudi Arabia always really hated Gaddafi because he was an open enemy of that country. Soon after, Gaddafi was gone and later also killed. Unfortunately, this war was very successful, bringing him down, but like in many cases, there was no real good mechanism in place for building a lasting peace in that country. Soon after, other factions started fighting each other, and up to today, the country is still in civil war and is very close to be considered a failed state. During more or less the same time, in Syria, another dictator decided to fight against his own people. But this time there was no international intervention, at least no direct one, because the United Nations were not able to support a resolution since they were vetoed by Russia and China. Instead of directly helping, United States, Arab countries and Turkey sent quite a lot of weapons and logistical support to the rebels. A huge civil war started in Syria, and the dictator Assad had a hard time containing it, was actually in the defensive. But then he got active military support by Iran and later Russia. On the other hand, as the rebellion progressed, within the rebellion, extremist faction came into power. And this led to the establishment of Islamic State later. And this ISIS, Islamic State, was considered a bigger problem for the West than Assad. So attention was diverted fighting ISIS. And of course, Assad was able to use it to his own advantage and ultimately was victorious in Syria, or almost victorious. But of course, at a huge cost to his people. The country is completely demolished and millions of refugees are living in other countries. 2014, Yemen, another civil war scene. The Houthi rebels attack and capture the capital and take control of the government. The previous officially elected government asked for international help. United Nations sanctions help, and the Saudi Arabia-led coalition intervenes militarily. The Houthi rebels fight back, and they are also supported by Iran because they are from the same Shia sect. But the Saudi-backed led coalition does not succeed against the Houthi rebels. And this despite the Western support, United States, UK, they were all supporting Saudi Arabia. As they failed to win against the Houthi rebels, the Saudi-led coalition becomes more and more brutal and also commit war crimes. And slowly they also start losing the Western support. The Houthis became stronger and stronger, and at the same time, Yemen is going through an enormous humanitarian catastrophe where millions of people starving. This is clearly another extremely failed intervention by the international community. In my opinion, based on the past 70 years of experience, we have to finally admit that United Nations is not the right organization for military interventions and peacekeeping. They lack, on one hand, the military hardware and the capacity, but also the willingness to fight. I think both are required for successful interventions and peacekeeping. Also on the decision-making side, they have deficits. The Security Council is often blocked by different conflicting interests, and they have two non-democratic countries as its members. Therefore, the United Nations should not be involved in this kind of activities, but focus more on its strengths, which is corporations and also humanitarian aid. Secondly, I think the experience also clearly shows that letting neighbors intervene in a country can be extremely dangerous. They easily become part of the problem, not the solution. They have often their own interests, conflicting interests, and therefore international community should be very careful in letting neighbors intervening in the other countries. These experiences clearly show what an important role the United States plays in international interventions. There's hardly any successful intervention without American involvement. But we also see that the United States lacks a coherent and rule-based intervention policy. It depends more on their moods and past experiences. They intervene successfully, they are motivated to do so again. Then they are fail somewhere and they are not motivated to intervene for a while. Perhaps a genocide happens and they are motivated to intervene again. Or their country got attacked and this time they want to intervene everywhere. So it's a very subjective and unpredictable kind of policy. But however, I don't want to just criticize the United States on this. Too many strong, rich, powerful countries waited on the sidelines and just waited the United States to play the policeman of the world. And that's an incredible job for just one country, too much on the shoulders of the United States. And especially now that the United States is clearly declining in power. Therefore, it's vital that democracies come together and act together on this. First of all, there should be clear rules of engagement. It should be predictable. Everyone should know when will the democracies finally intervene militarily. Secondly, there needs to be capacity. That also goes a bit beyond the United States to act also militarily successfully. Thirdly, there should also be capacity also for rules for peace building. So basically, you cannot just intervene militarily and then let the country deal with the mess like we did in the past. We need to do all these three things together, and we need to do it now. I mean, the recent events have clearly shown that we have no time to waste. This is one of the most important topics for humanity today, but also for its future.